Hello, my name is Lizzie Gourd and I am the Classics Hub Coordinator for Bristol and the South West. Welcome to this introduction video on Ovid in the West Country 2020. Ovid in the West Country is an annual competition run jointly by the Bristol Classics Hub and UWE Bristol and is part of an initiative set up by the Cambridge Schools Classics Project to help promote classics in state schools. This year we are particularly excited to be launching a new strand of the competition for students in years 5 and 6, in addition to our existing entry category for those in years 7 and 8. The competition runs in the autumn term when teachers and students are able to explore a number of classical mythologies in the classroom, using audio recordings made accessible via the Classical Tales Resources website. We also have transcripts, teachers' notes and storyboards available to help you in your teaching. These ancient stories include popular mythologies such as Daedalus and Icarus, Echo and Narcissus, and Theseus and the Minotaur, as well as lesser-known tales such as that of Actaeon or Cygnus. You may wish to explore all of the stories made available on the website, or instead to focus on a select few to discuss with your students. Once they have had a chance to reflect on these stories, students are encouraged to respond creatively to a myth of their choosing and to submit their entry into the competition. In previous years, we have received entries in a range of different media, including photography, 3D models, illustrations, textiles, creative writing, short videos and computer animations. Students have loved the creative freedom this has given them, and teachers have commented on the valuable opportunity for creativity that this competition affords. When assessing the entries, judges are primarily guided by the notion of creative storytelling. Does the entry convey something about the essence of the myth? Has the student responded creatively and sensitively to the story in question? The first round of the competition is held internally at each school, where the top 3 entries are decided by teachers or fellow students. Some schools choose to display their entries in their hall or library and give students the opportunity to vote for their favourites. The winning entries from each school are then submitted into the final round, which is judged by the competition organisers. This year, our prize-giving ceremony will be held at the Roman Baths, who have kindly offered to host us, COVID permitting. All shortlisted pupils will be invited to this ceremony, along with their teachers and parents, and a number of different prizes and commendations will be awarded. Now we're going to hear from Joan Foley, PGCE Secondary English Course Leader at UWE Bristol, who will explain a bit more about the history of the competition and the value of introducing classical mythologies into the classroom. After that, we'll hear from Bob Lister, author of the Classical Tales Resources website and organiser of the first Cambridge event on which our own competition is modelled. Bob will explain the importance of continuing this oral tradition and why it is so much more effective and engaging for students of all abilities to hear these stories read out loud.
Hello, my name is Joan Foley and I'm the PGC Secondary English Course Leader at UWE in Bristol. I'd like to share with you some of the work that we've been engaged in over the past years in developing resources and approaches to using classical tales in the secondary English classroom. But why should we be sharing classical myths in the English classroom at all, and why now? Well, it seems to me that there is some space in the national curriculum and some space in our Key Stage 3 curriculum time to share some of these really key seminal stories with our young learners. They're stories that have messages, perhaps, that speak to those young people as they begin to make decisions as they're moving into young adulthood. They're stories actually that also chime with a current interest in all things classical. It won't have escaped your notice that there are a number of really powerful beautifully written modern retellings of those classical myths. And what's really interesting, perhaps for students in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, is that those stories are told from different perspectives. So with Circe, The Silence of the Girls and A Thousand Ships, we have the voices of the female characters in those classic myths. But it's also perhaps worth pointing out that currently the Ofsted framework is asking us to consider a deepening of subject knowledge, an expansion of subject knowledge, and an enriching of subject knowledge. The term cultural capital, whilst it might well be contested, is a term that you will find in the Ofsted framework. And I think that these stories do allow us perhaps to explore some of the texts, some of the ideas that students would really value when they are looking at other texts in the school curriculum. So to read Shakespeare and to have some knowledge of Ovid might well be a very useful and enriching experience. But the stories are simply good in themselves. So whilst they might contribute to character education or spiritual and moral education, and they do, I think they're also valuable because they are, as Levi Strauss said, stories that are good to think with. Trainees were asked why they might share those stories with young people, and they talked about how those stories for them are exciting and stimulating. They recognise their place in the cultural heritage. They recognise their place also in the national curriculum. And they also about the fact that children have an entitlement. They have a right to know these stories because they are some of the best stories ever told. When we've worked on this with our schools in partnership, English departments have talked about the joy of storytelling, about the focus on story and how that's led to really fruitful discussions. They've talked about the ways in which creative learning, engaged learning has taken place. And they've also talked about the ways in which oracy have been forefronted through a focus on the storytelling, the sharing of those stories, both teacher to student to teacher, and student to student. And what did the children say in the work that we did? They absolutely adored the stories. They talked about how they were stories that stick in your head. They're stories that resonate. They're stories that speak to you after you've finished telling those stories. They've talked about the stories being amazing. They've made links with other things they've read. So to know something about classical myths also enables you to think about Harry Potter in a different way, perhaps in a more informed way. Students really love these classical tales, and a unit of work which might simply focus on myth, that might use myths from different cultures and also focus on classical myths, would be a very rich and enriching element of your Key Stage 3 curriculum. So over the past few years, we've taken Ovid into our classrooms, we've taken them into local schools, and we've engaged in storytelling pedagogy. We've shared those stories either through the teachers themselves telling the stories, or teachers using audio retelling those tales by Hugh Lupton and Daniel Morden. And students have responded most positively by using both the oral retelling of the story, but also art and imagery to help them visualise what the tales are about. So here we have some reconstructions of Icarus's wings. Here we have students weaving a web, a story web based on the tale of Arachne, so that then those ingredients of that story are hung on Arachne's web. We have students using paper plates, paper puppets that retell the story of Perseus. And you can see that as they've been working on that tale, they've explored a kind of mood board, looking at the art from the period, from classical periods, but also more modern retellings of that story to help them think about their own storytelling. Students have thought about Echo and Narcissus by focusing in on a very famous painting from the pre-Raphaelite period, using that as a way into thinking about the story, leading them into storyboarding, and then from that storyboarding being able to retell the story back. And storyboarding again was used here with students thinking about the story of Pandora's box. And here we have examples of work by students for whom literacy is a challenge, but freed from the text and so using an oral text, those students were able to engage with the story in a way which was wholly authentic. That work has then further developed into what is now Ovid in the West Country, our annual competition, where we encourage departments to share those classic myths in their Key Stage 3 curriculum and to ask them to respond to those myths in as creative and imaginative a way as possible, but in order to tell the story. So here in 2018, Patchway Community School opened up that work to the whole of their Year 7 curriculum. There were 66 final entries into their competition, and all students from the school were invited into the library to decide on who they thought were the best 3 entries to go forward to the finals. So we can see model making, we can see painting, we can see drawing, we can see writing, we can see artwork of all kinds. And what you can't see there are examples of the films they made, the animations they made, even interpretive dance. Here we have some other examples of entries for the competition from a range of schools, and again just the level of creativity and engagement that is obvious from these examples shows you how powerful this unit of work can be. To help support you, you might well want to look at some of the materials that I offer to the PGCE English trainees when they engage on this storytelling pedagogy. We read the work of Heine Meyer from 2017, in which there are discussions about storytelling pedagogy and its impact on the classroom. We've looked at extracts of Betty Rosen's very seminal writing about storytelling and teachers as storytellers. We've had fun listening to Neil Gaiman and Stephen Fry from the Hay Festival, where they talk about the significance and the importance of myths. And we've also gone back to Shakespeare, and we've looked at what the RSC has said about Ovid the storyteller. In fact, they had a focus on that a few years ago, and their materials online about Ovid and Shakespeare would prove to be really helpful material for you to also explore. In addition, there are some articles that you might care to read. This first one is by Lorna Smith and by me, in our project Talking Together and Learning Together, where we reflected on the early stages of this project. And then there is a later article that I've written for Nate's magazine, in which I focus in on teacher voice and creativity using storytelling as a pedagogy. But I think what I want to emphasise more than anything is that these stories and these materials are highly useful, highly usable during this current period. So if you are looking for materials that you can share with your students, and because we're having to work in this online way, we need to find materials which are rich, then certainly suggest that you look at these materials on Ovid and Metamorphoses. The storytelling is absolutely beautiful. You'll be taken into the world of the Metamorphoses. The stories are beautifully paced, beautifully rich, very engaging. And then to ask your students to think about those stories, perhaps use some of the materials that are available there to help frame those discussions, and to spend time sharing those stories, perhaps with their own families, and thinking about how they might respond as storytellers to them, would, I think, be a really powerful way of starting off the new school year. We were lucky to be able to go into schools last year and in the previous years to share those stories. We don't know what September 2020 will bring, but it is quite likely that a lot of teaching and learning will need to be online. I certainly think that the materials for Ovid in the West Country that you'll find linked to the website here will be a really excellent starting point for your work. and we look forward very much to seeing what you're able to share with us. Thank you.
I'm Bob Lister, and I was part of the team that launched the Ovid in the West Country competition in 2017. 3 years before that, I had set up a website, Classical Tales, designed with Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 students in mind particularly, to provide stories from classical mythology told by two of the UK's leading storytellers, Hugh Lupton and Daniel Morden. I'd like to give you a flavour of the retellings on the website by playing a short extract from their account of the Trojan War, and before that I'd like to provide a little context. Achilles, the best fighter on the Greek side, has refused to fight after a very serious spat with Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek armies. As a result, the Trojans gained the upper hand in the fighting and have now threatened to overrun the Greek camp. In desperation at the situation, Achilles' best friend Patroclus goes to him and says, "If you yourself, Achilles, are not prepared to fight, will you at least let me borrow your armour so that I can go out and see if I can put the Trojans to flight?" Achilles reluctantly agrees, but he warns Patroclus not to go too far. Well, we all know how that ends, don't we? Sure enough, Patroclus goes out in Achilles' armour, terrifies the Trojans, who retreat back to the city, but Patroclus overreaches himself and is killed outside the gates of Troy by Hector, Troy's greatest warrior. Incandescent with rage, Achilles sets aside his grievance with Agamemnon, goes out into the field and kills Hector. We hear what happens next.
And Achilles dragged the body of Hector to his chariot. He tore off his armour, he threw it into the car of the chariot, and then from his belt he took a knife. He lifted one of Hector's feet, and he pierced a hole through the heel, between the tendon and the bone, and the same with the other foot. And then he got a length of ox-hide thong, and he threaded it through the holes, and he tied it. And he tied the other end of the thong to the back of his chariot. He leapt into the car of the chariot. He whipped the horses to a gallop, and he drove them round and round the city walls of Troy, 3 times round, screaming and screaming. And behind the chariot, the body of Hector bouncing, the face of Hector tearing a furrow into the nourishing earth.
This is a memorable, if shocking, episode, one made all the more so by Hugh's vivid retelling of the scene. And we can see from the illustrations that accompany the retelling, drawn by a Year 5 student, the extent to which students can see what's happening in their mind's eye as they listen to the story unfold. This power of the spoken word to trigger mental images and fire the imagination is something brought out by a teacher from a North London primary school. Point of view as a teacher, how did you find using an audio stimulus for teaching as opposed to a text?
Oh, it was amazing. They were completely enraptured by it, and I think it was so different for them, because I actually was talking to some of them recently about it and said, did you find it hard to concentrate when you were listening to the tape? And all of them said, no, it was really nice because we could imagine it for ourselves, we could imagine the characters for ourselves, and I think that's so rare for them, because so many of them, have so much kind of visual stimulus in terms of computer games and TV and film, and to just take all of that away and just let them use their imagination.
Not only does storytelling fire the imagination, it also indelibly fixes the story in the student's mind. Weeks later, they can recall key events in close detail, as we can see from the following animated discussion in which 3 girls tell me what they think about the characters of Achilles and Hector.
I like Achilles more because, even he killed loads of people. I liked him because he was really strong and he was an interesting character.
Right.
But I like him more than Hector because Hector killed Patroclus.
Right, so you don't like him because of that?
Yeah.
But he had to do it, didn't he? Because he was on the other side.
Yeah.
So there's kind of no way to not kill him or not.
No, he didn't have any choice really, did he?
Hector's wife said that Achilles killed her parents and all of her family.
Yes, well remembered.
Yeah,
when he held his baby, the baby started crying because the helmet, and then he had to take the helmet off, and then
it started laughing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Hector was scared when Achilles came and they ran 3 times around the Trojan
And what happened?
Well, basically, he grabbed the, I think it was the spear, and they were just arguing, and then he put it through his throat, and then he took it out, and then he made holes in his feet, and then he tied it with a rope, and then
put it on the
chariot.
And then he went round 3 times the city walls.
When I watch this clip, I'm always struck by the level of the girls' engagement and enthusiasm, by their willingness to share with me their thoughts and ideas about Hector and Achilles, even though they've only met me for the first time half an hour earlier. It's particularly evident when they describe Achilles killing Hector. The girl nearest the camera reenacts the thrust of Achilles' spear. It's really important to note that this high level of attainment is not confined to the able student. In any Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3 classroom, we know that there is likely to be a wide range of reading attainment, from those students who are still struggling to decode individual words, let alone read whole sentences with understanding, through to confident, fluent readers who are happy to go home after school and sit down to read Harry Potter without any outside assistance. Storytelling removes the barrier of the printed word. This is why, in the words of Philip Pullman, it is such a democratic activity. We can hear now from 2 teachers explaining the benefits that they see from this levelling of the playing field, both for themselves as teachers and for the lower attaining students.
Well, yeah, the span of the whole group is that we have children who are still learning to decode words. So if they were trying to read that as a guided reading book or as a set text, they wouldn't get past page 1.
No.
But similarly, we've got children who could read it cover to cover with a dictionary next to them, they'd understand it. But they love the storytelling. That offers, it takes away the barrier of decoding. We can pause it and talk about it. It means we're all up to the same point in the story together, and we can sort of say, well, what's just happened? And it means that you are definitely all experiencing it on the same time, at least. You've got that sort of thing that you can manage it.
Yeah.
The lower attainer children here engaged in texts which they'd never have engaged in. We saw them in a completely different way. We suddenly saw that these children that, given a story to read, produced very little, were suddenly wanting to write, suddenly wanting to tell people about this story. We're using that sort of language, the lovely metaphors in their writing, and we're quite proud of the fact. Other children could see children that they'd thought perhaps weren't so clever, suddenly able to converse and actually use inference and deduction and hold their own in a situation. It was exciting to see the children. It was fun. And the children, I don't know, that really encouraged them to want to go and read more. We had children tackling texts at the end of it that they'd never have picked up before.
Let's finish by hearing from Daniel Morden, whose voice we haven't heard yet, and his views on the value for young audiences of hearing stories from classical mythology. Happy listening.
Hugh and I regard our storytelling as cinema of the mind. What we're trying to do in any performance is give you, the audience, the opportunity to imagine the events of the story inside your mind's eye. The ideal for us is that we vanish and you see the story instead of us. So these recordings are an ideal medium for our storytelling. There's an assumption that Greek myths are somehow difficult and obscure, that they're high culture, the preserve of the intellectual, that they're difficult to understand. But our experience is that once you take away the written text, they're incredibly accessible. We have tried these stories over and over and over again in front of young people for something like 25 years. And they arrive with no preconceptions except that they want to be entertained. And if you just give them the essence of the story, then they're gripped by them. They're charmed and they're thrilled and they're chilled by them. And after all, the Greek myths are our birthright. They are a cornerstone of our culture. Everyone should know them. And so we're delighted that the project continues and we wish it all the best.
Given current uncertainties around education and how schools will be operating from September, we've made this year's competition as COVID-friendly as possible. This means that all materials can be accessed online and shared remotely with students where necessary. All of our online resources are free to use and the competition is free to enter. As Bob and Joan have already iterated, these classical stories are exciting, accessible and engaging for students of all backgrounds and abilities. So we hope you can get involved. Thank you.